Emperor Tiberius and the Tokoloshe. A story by Damon Yeld. Read by Robert Boring. I bet you always fancied yourself as the protagonist, yeah? It can be humbling when you discover you aren't, yeah? This from my cat, Emperor Tiberius, as I lay twitching on the floor. I had just lost an overly complicated battle with an extension cord, 2 shopping bags, and the wet floor. He didn't use human speech to express this comment, of course, but his meaning was obvious enough. I, the custodian, named Robert Boring, was feeling decidedly cursed at the moment. Superstition is a funny thing, it creeps up on you and trips you up, even if you claim to not believe in it. The Emperor and I had just recently moved to Shelley Beach on the KZN South Coast. I had applied for a transfer within the hold department and been granted it. True, the position I held in Johannesburg, of exceedingly dull saxophone soloist, had paid more, but my role of mildly sleep-inducing voice-over artist made for a rewarding use of my droning voice. Nancy, unfortunately, had a fine, near-creaky voice, so she was stuck in the behind-the-scenes technical department, never to know the gleam of the spotlight. Having just wrapped up the recording for a new Vodacom promotion, we were having our lunch in the above-ground parking lot adjacent to the taxi rank. It was June and the sun was heavenly. I was just regaling Nancy with how cold it got in Johannesburg when an enormously plump lady waddled over from the taxi rank. She railed off a gout of isiZulu at Nancy, who was initially dismissive, then chastened. I don't speak isiZulu, but I caught her manner and tone. The stout lady was quite old and seemed angry. She grabbed Nancy by the wrist, as if to tug her away somewhere. Nancy resisted and I stood, trying to be the voice of reason. Now, there's no need for that. What is the problem? I am not an intimidating presence. The unfamiliar lady recognized this, ignoring me. Nancy yanked her hand away with a yelp of pain. I moved between them, trying to assert myself. The lady's right eye seemed to move independently of the left, and rolled in my direction malevolently. Finally acknowledging my presence, she uttered a guttural reply. My scalp prickled with her venomous intent, while her hand shot out quick as a viper, striking my solar plexus. Gasping, my knees gave in, and I pathetically fell to the ground. Her dirty, bare feet were right in front of my nose, greasy. She had some kind of animal hide wrapped around her ankle. Between the blossoming pain and the reeking feet I thought I might lose consciousness. Thankfully, the lady and Nancy concluded their altercation and she waddled off before that happened. Nancy kneeled at my side, gently rolling me over onto my back. "I'm really sorry, Robert," she exclaimed, looking ashen. "Not to worry," I wheezed. "I'm quite used to falling down." "No, I mean, I'm sorry for that too, but," she cursed you. Nancy clarified. "What nonsense," I told her. "The tokoloshe will come for you," she said ominously. Back in my kitchen. The Emperor was staring at something behind me. I flipped over slowly onto my belly, turning my head to see what it might be. Nothing. "Twat," I commented, getting to my feet and giving the Emperor a stroke. He arched his back and screamed, leaping down and straight to his bowl. I should mention that Emperor Tiberius is deaf. He doesn't meow so much as yell, which he continued to do now as it was feeding time. About an hour later I was in the lounge with the Emperor on my lap watching some TV soapy and we heard a bangarang from the kitchen. I say we, because the Emperor turned his head as though he had also heard it. He would sometimes do that, it was eerie, like how he came when I called him. He also seemed to sense the noise from the kitchen. We got up to investigate, he, with all the confidence of a drunk driver fleeing from a head-on collision, speeding through, tail straight up, into the dark kitchen, yelling as he went. I turned the light on, peering in. The Emperor was sitting in front of his bowl, which was clearly empty. He doesn't usually empty his bowl, tonight had been no different. He usually finished up before milk, when I got up to make my after-dinner coffee. Something had cleaned his bowl. He looked at me in disapproval and yelled. "I concur," I murmured, stroking his head. "Seems we have an interloper." Having searched the entire kitchen, opening the back door, scouring the garden and finding no other signs of our visitor, we resumed our usual routine. I closed the kitchen window and then we had milk, coffee, more TV, and bed. Later, that evening. I had not really entertained the prospect that our interloper was anything more than a hungry stray cat, or perhaps a rodent. So, when I let the Emperor out for his nightly territorial spritz and compost making, I also put out a bowl of pellets and a bowl of milk at the edge of the num-num hedge. I reckoned it was the most likely venue for a stowaway. My grandmother used to tell us when we were children, if an animal approaches you for assistance, it is a blessing and your solemn duty to do what you can, to help it. The next morning the milk and pellets were gone. At work Nancy cautiously asked me if anything unusual had happened. I told her about my evening. She was gobsmacked. "But, that must be the tokoloshe. You can't feed him," she cried. I decided to play along, given my ignorance about her superstition. "And why not? Do they not get hungry?" I asked her, smiling to reassure myself of what I had immediately assumed as the triviality of her concerns. "Yo, Robert, the tokoloshe is very dangerous. You can't play games with it," she told me breathlessly. "What would you suggest I do?" I asked her, feeling a little annoyed. "You must apologize to Margumede, and hope that she calls him off," she concluded. I shrugged. "I don't think I'll do that. I did nothing wrong," I responded. For the rest of the week I continued to put food and milk out for my visitor, and every morning it was finished. Emperor Tiberius seemed satisfied with the arrangement, now that a boundary had been instituted and his own food was not being poached by the stranger. By the 7th evening we had both become accustomed to our invisible stray. I started referring to him as Colin of the garden, as he seemed to be satisfied with keeping to himself in the garden. We still had not heard, nor seen him yet, which suited us fine. Late one night, I was woken by a commotion outside. Loud, angry, sonorous voices arguing in isiZulu, then yelling as though terrified. Running, shouting, a gunshot, followed by 5 more deafening blasts. Then, complete silence. I lay paralyzed, wondering what was next. Should I get up? Investigate? The Emperor had hardly stirred from his spot behind my knees. Being deaf has its advantages. I lay upright in my bed for a long time, listening. Eventually, the pragmatic wisdom of fatigue prevailed, and when my head found the pillow, I fell asleep again. The next morning I had almost forgotten about the strange incident until I stepped outside to let the Emperor out for his morning business and to feed Colin. My garden was in complete disarray. There was the purple rhododendron bush which was flattened, looking like several people had fallen on it, then the frangipani, which must have been messy with all that sticky, white, gluey blood. It resembled a squashed insect. The lawn itself looked ragged, as though many feet had been marching up and down, or perhaps had played host to a rugby match. At the far end, the maroon and pink dappled eucalyptus hedge had collapsed in several places, as though yet more people had made it their temporary battlefield. The thick, spiny num-num hedge where I fed Colin was intact, though. I heard a soft, pained moan from inside the bush. Leaning down, I stooped to see if I could see what was making it, and was only greeted by shadow, so I knelt. Edging closer to the half-circular opening, I thought I saw movement in the shadow. "Colin? Is that you?" I asked. There was a faint moan in reply, seemingly far off. Curious, now, I inched right to the edge of the bush and stuck my head under, slowly. Vertigo jarred me and I felt like I was falling. I closed my eyes to try to stabilize and I heard a pop, falling forward on my face, gasping and lifting myself off the sand. My eyes flew open. I was on the shore of a river. It was very dim, like dusk. I was still in my pajamas. I seemed to be on the sandy shore of a seemingly infinite river. It was pretty gloomy, so perhaps it wasn't infinite. At least it was light enough to see by. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water. It was quite peaceful, in fact. Until the screams started. It began with a surprised yelp, which stretched into a prolonged, agonized wail of pain. Then another, yielding into a chorus. It was coming from the darkness behind me, in what sounded like a cave, echoes bouncing and reverberating, overlapping each other. Investigating the cause shouldn't have been at the top of my agenda. What rational person hears this and thinks, "Ah yes, screaming. I think I'll take a closer look"? Yet, I appeared to be edging toward it, regardless. Definitely human screaming. I wondered if these were the same men from last night. Logic dictated that there was very little likelihood that this was another group of agonized individuals. My dark-adapted eyes caught a flicker of pale light. Then, a wan glow seeped out of an opening a few meters ahead, accompanied by a clamorous, semi-musical noise. It took my mind a moment to register it was a ringtone from a cell phone. The sound was so bizarre and corrupted, like a warped calliope reverberating in the cave and degrading with an echo. I caught shadows swaying across the light as though the wailers were hanging from something. Eventually I reached the cave mouth. 3 men were dangling from the cave ceiling by their ankles, still mostly clothed, although their clothing had been ripped so badly they may as well have been nude. In front of them was a very hairy, very short humanoid. It had long, sharp claws which it was using to playfully scratch at the men in turn, while growling contentedly. As the creature scratched, blood would seep out, which accounted for the wailing and swaying. "You shall not hurt the father," I heard my own voice say, which was incredible, since I had not spoken. Then again, muttering it like a chant, I realized with a prickling of my scalp that it was coming from the hairy being. "Colin?" I suddenly said. My own face turned to look at me, eyes wide, the mirror of my own surprise. "The mother sent them to hurt you, because I didn't. I was supposed to hurt you. But I couldn't go back. They do things to children and hurt them, these men." With that revelation, Colin shuffled up to me, hugging my knees. I realized that not only was he hairy, but he also had some kind of quills growing out of his body, rather like a porcupine. There came another of those pops, and suddenly we were all in my back garden again. Colin, who now was indeed a porcupine, myself, and the 3 bleeding wailers, who were dazed, drunkenly mumbling and stumbling to their feet. They beat as hasty a retreat as they were able. I glanced down at Colin, who ruffled his quills and scooted back under the num-num. The Emperor viewed all of this with mild interest from his vantage point at the back door, seeming to say, "Are you quite finished?" At work, I talked it over with Nancy at lunch, telling her of my travailing. She accepted it quite readily. She was rather taken aback that the tokoloshe had behaved this way. One evening I put out Colin's food, half expecting him to emerge. He didn't. I didn't sleep well that night. Everything was tumbling around in my head, churning, and every sound from outside made me listen closer, in case it was another wave of wailing visitors. I was also listening out for Colin, as though I would be able to distinguish any particular sound. One morning I went out to the back garden, which was still a mess. Colin's bowls were still untouched. I frowned deeply, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Dread is a cruel blade, aiming for only the most tender parts. The frown was to settle on my forehead like a visor, thick and heavy, tainting my mood as I moved about my day in a distracted, agitated way. At lunch I was withdrawn. Nancy was trying to engage me, but I wasn't having any of it. Wena. Umlungu. Ndini. Do you like my new necklace? A voice jeered, jarring me from my reverie of sad worry. I turned around to face its owner, heart beating madly. I didn't know you speaking. I broke off. It was Margomede. She looked ragged but triumphant. Scratches all over her, puncture marks on her hands and face. She was grinning at us. The necklace she was referencing was a string of porcupine quills hanging around her neck. I went stone cold, slowly realizing what I was looking at. This is what happens when you interfere. She told us, eyes wide, shaking the necklace at me. I started forward, not knowing what my intention was, just seething with a truly uncommon rage. She hadn't come alone. 2 new bodyguards stepped toward me. They grabbed me by the shoulders, forcing me to bow on the ground before her, each with a firm grip on my hands and neck. She came forward confidently, placing a foot on each side of my head, then squatted. Warm urine splashed the back of my head and ran down into my face, my eyes, my mouth. She sat heavily on my neck and I blacked out. When I awoke I was in the staff toilet. Nancy was standing over me, looking worried. The smell of blood in my nostrils, I sat up raggedly. I washed your head, she supplied quietly. I sat there for a few moments, breathing, as the situation coalesced in my mind. Nancy hovered silently. There wasn't anything else to say. I felt hollowed out. I took a few days off work. I just huddled in my house with Emperor Tiberius all day and all night, stroking him, feeding him, letting him out. When I let him out I would go and stand by the num-num, staring. The first few times I stuck my head in, hoping to be transported again, but nothing happened. I was mourning. I would have crying fits and be comforted by Emperor Tiberius. The mindless tragedy of Colin's death was harrowing. I wanted to do something about it. I got drunk one night on brandy and coke, and resolved to venture out to find Margomede. I realized I had no idea where to begin, so I phoned Nancy. No, Robert, you will be killed. I won't tell you anything. Just leave it alone, please, she begged. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, I was forced to reluctantly admit. Sighing deeply, I rang off after thanking her. A week passed and my routine lulled me back into a normal existence. Until, one night, sitting in the lounge, watching TV, I heard a noise from the kitchen. Emperor Tiberius also perked up. We went in, my heart pounding, to find his bowl empty. I grabbed some pellets and raced outside to the back garden. There was a porcupine, lingering near the num-num. He had a rough patch on the back where some fur was missing, along with quills. I went over and poured some pellets into Colin's old bowl, which I still kept in its place. Leaning down, I stroked the animal reassuringly. The porcupine hesitated, and I had to wonder to myself, is this Colin? Either way he began eating, and after a short while was grunting contentedly as Colin used to while he ate. When he was satisfied, he turned, seeming to indicate that I follow as he waddled into the num-num. Curious, I hunched down and awkwardly followed what seemed to be a moment of truth. There was that strange, disorienting pop and I was back on the shore in twilight. Without preamble Colin headed for the cave, back in his semi-human form, waving for me to follow. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but my curiosity soon turned to confusion as I saw who was in the cave. Margomede. She was smiling at me, Colin happily rubbing against her legs as she sat,